On the podcast today, we are going to speak about Chapter 77 of the Tao Te Ching, which makes up the 77th episode of the 81 Meditations on the Tao Te Ching. And as usual, Guyang will read Jia Fu Feng and Jane English's translation, and I will read Derek Lin's translation.
The Tao of heaven is like bending a bow. The high is lowered and the low is raised. If the string is too long, it is shortened. If there is not enough, it is made longer. The Tao of heaven is to take from those who have too much and give to those who do not have enough. Ordinary people act differently. They take from those who do not have enough and give to those who already have too much. Who has more than enough and gives it to the world? Only the wise. Therefore, the wise work without recognition. They achieve what has to be done without dwelling on it. They do not try to show their knowledge.
The Tao of heaven is like drawing a bow. Lower that which is high, raise that which is low. Reduce that which is excessive, add to that which is insufficient. The Tao of heaven reduces the excessive and adds to the insufficient. The Tao of people is not so, reducing the insufficient in order to offer to the excessive. Who can offer their excess to the world? Only those who have the Tao. Therefore sages act without conceit, achieve without claiming credit. They do not wish to display their virtue. So in this chapter we are talking about the balancing principle of the Tao, and we have a representation of that, which is the bow. So when we draw the bow, the higher becomes lower and the lower becomes raised. And so we have that type of example to explain this type of balancing principle.
Yeah, so I think in this case, the Taoist concept of shang-sheng can be applied, I think. I don't know if many people are familiar with this concept. The shang-sheng means a mutually arising aspect of nature. Just like bending a bow, like in this chapter, Jiao Lao explains, like the higher part, the top part gets lowered and bottom part gets raised. So it's a mutually arising to bring it the bow into function, right? Mm-hmm. So that both parts working together and makes perfect balance in order to be able to use as a bow, right? So that mutually arising concept is applied to this the first line.
Exactly, the yin yang and everything, and so. Part of this chapter, when we look at that from a sociological perspective, is the idea of if we don't follow that balancing principle, we kind of have a situation where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And so in the chapter, Lao Tzu kind of alludes to the way of people in relation to that, as opposed to the balancing principle of the Tao. So you have a situation where people have excess and some people have far less, right? And there's not this kind of coming together of the bow where the higher it becomes lower and the lower becomes raised, and so you don't have this type of equilibrium. And so that's an analogy for the society, but it's also an analogy for the individual too, how we conduct our own lives. Because when we look at the balancing principle of the Tao, we can use like water as an analogy here, where if you throw ice cubes into a glass of water and just leave it alone, the water will become cold, the ice cubes will melt, and eventually the water will return to room temperature, right? And that's that sort of complete balance of the Tao. And that's actually the way things are. We kind of are short-sighted because we might see certain situations in the world where something is going on, but then over time, you see this type of balancing effect that happens even on a grander scale, not just on your own individual life. But this chapter is talking about both the individual and the collective. And so you see this balancing effect that happens naturally, actually. So you might see, for example, a political situation where one political party has gone way too far in one direction, and then there's a counter effect where there's a balancing effect. It's like in Hermeticism when they talk about the pendulum, right? So the pendulum always will revert back to the other side. Mm-hmm. And so the point of that is to try and find this type of equilibrium, this balance, which is actually naturally there. Mm-hmm. And we see it play out collectively because we do see the pendulum swing, and we do see that in our own lives as well. But the thing is, like, are we cognizant of it? Do we have the mind of the sage? Because the sage is the one who's seeing this play out. Where, as Lao Tzu says in this chapter, that the way of the people is to think that they can hold steadfast to one side without having the pendulum swing back in the opposite direction.
Yes, what often we are short-sighted is that, there are problems in the world and also our individual lives, right? So that we need to do something about it, right? So nevertheless, we do something about it or we don't do something about it, actually outcome is not much different, right?
No.
So as you mentioned, it all comes back to that middle way, like in the balance, perfect balanced way, right? So whether we do something about it or we don't do something about it, it all, again, like nature has its own way to balance things out, right? And also for people who are like aware of that, the fact that everything will come back to its natural way, or we are completely unaware of that. So knowing it or not knowing it, at the end of the day, it'll find its own balance anyway. So I think the matter of, do we want to be in a way that we're aware of it?
Yep.
Or not aware of it. Obviously, we want to be aware of it. If you are aware of it, like Lao Tzu is saying, you become the wise one that gives to abundance to the poor and from the rich people. Like, it's making perfect balance, right? Yeah, so even, with the interference as well, like with the problems, if we want to interfere with it and let it come to its balance on its own, so you go through a lot of rigorous force and effort and trying to control things and make things a certain way to solve the problem, or you want to just leave it be, again, like practice of Wu Wei, just let things just be as they are, and it'll come back to its own balance on its own, right? So do we want to just leave it alone, like you said with the water analogy? Let it just come to the room temperature naturally, or are you going to do something about it to bring it down to the room temperature as quick as possible? But nevertheless, it'll come back to that temperature regardless, right? So, do we want to go through that pain and suffering from interfering things, or do we just want to let it be and just let it bring it to its own balance on its own?
Well, that recognition is a big thing, right? Like having the recognition that you can see from that Wu-Wei mentality. Because as we mentioned with the ice cube analogy, is that nature yearns for equilibrium. Like its nature is actually equilibrium to reach a state of homeostasis, right? And so the way of humans, we constantly forget that we are actually an aspect of nature, but we're acting out of accord with nature. And I'm not just talking on a collective level, I'm talking individually, how we behave and how we think about ourselves, our internal terrain, how we treat others, and so forth and so on. And so it's our recognition that's not there. And so we don't recognize from that Wu-Wei perspective. That's what differentiates us from the sage, right? The sage lives in a state of Wu-Wei because they understand, like the farmer and son in the Zen story, that all things run its course. It's not like a good and bad dichotomy dissecting life, right? Like his son unfortunately broke his leg, but he couldn't go to war then, right? Where a lot of his friends went to war and they all died in war. So there's sometimes a silver lining in a lot of things that we experience in life, but it's only upon hindsight that we see it. The difference between us and the sage is the sage doesn't live in hindsight. The sage sees it straight away. There's no hindsight. The sage lives from Wu-Wei and knows that this will run its course and things will balance out. But people who follow the way of people will they'll try to force their opinions on other people, their perspective, their beliefs, their attitudes, and it doesn't work. But even in that grander scheme of things, they're only a part of the Tao playing out too. And so the sage is still looking at that thinking that it'll level out eventually. But those people are going to struggle and suffer to get to that stage, where the sage's perspective is that instead of going all the way around, we can just recognize that now. And so we don't have to go on this ridiculous journey of suffering and struggle, striving and so forth and so on. We can just recognize that now.
Yes.
And if we recognize it now, we can have a state of equilibrium all throughout the world.
Yes. Yeah, just you struggle all those steps only to get to the same destination, basically, right? So we need to obviously be in a place where sage's perspective, where you can just sit back and being able to observe without any interference and let it just play out, and whatever outcome will be, but in a way that you are trusting that whatever will be is perfectly how it's supposed to be, right? And we should be able to accept it, no matter we like it or we don't like it, right? Again, like and don't like, right or wrong, this dichotomy always gets us in trouble, right? And because we have likes and dislikes and right and wrong kind of concept very strongly, we often like to control the result to be in favor of whatever you want, right? But again, that's somewhat the arrogance that we have, I think. Whereas nature don't see what's good or bad for us personally, or what we like or don't like. The nature could care less, actually. So it'll always just kind of give you what it's supposed to be, like what's supposed to be resulted by whatever the process was.
Yeah. And this is not a message of that the rich should give all their money to the poor and make themselves broke, right? This is where people get this message wrong as well, because that again is force, right? That's not the way of nature. And so what it's kind of meaning, like, on a sociological perspective, is that those with the means will provide for those without the means to give them hope and the potential to change their lives, right? Like, it's not a message of Marxist equality. Like, I am never going to be as good as Michael Jordan at basketball. It's okay, I can live with that, right? And so it's not that type of message that we're all going to have the same means to achieve the same ends. That's not natural as well, right? We all have our own our own particular natures that are going to run their course in our life, and we will achieve what we will, and we will have the experiences that we will according to how the Tao determines it, right?
Yes.
Like, for example, we have this podcast, and it's the niche of the niche, right? Talking about Eastern spirituality and philosophy. It's obviously not as popular as a podcast about football, for example, right? And so are we going to sit around crying and whining that, we're not in a position that those football podcasts are? That's just the way of the people. That's not the way, it's just the way it is, right? It's not anything to debate. And so you don't want to exaggerate this chapter and think that, okay, this is about just giving to the poor and this and that. You don't want to turn it into an unnatural approach. It's about raising those who are lower, in air quotes, as the lower part of the bow, raising them to give them hope and the potential to better their lives, right? And we probably all wish we had that opportunity from someone when we were younger, instead of toiling away and to get there. But there's also a way in that as well, right? And so you don't want to split the atom here when you look at this type of chapter. You want to see that even if you're in a lower position, in air quotes, that staying the course will bring you towards a natural equilibrium. Fighting your situation and this and that is not going to help. It doesn't mean, what I'm saying is, obviously striving in that sense is not bad, but like complaining and this and that, or playing the victim and so forth and so on, it's not going to lead you to hope, love, compassion, and all of these types of moral virtues that we naturally have.
Yeah, in this chapter, the Lao Tzu make an example of the poor and the rich and how we should share that materialistic needs. And that is, I think, used as a more like a, yes, it is true, and also it is used as a bit of like a symbol as well, like as an so to explain bigger things than just the material needs, I think. The poor and the rich, of course, so we can peg it as that way, and like you said, that people might misunderstand as like a more very like a socialistic, communist way of thinking. They like divert the like a food and the materialistic needs equally to everyone and this and that. That's not. I don't think that's what Lao Tzu is talking about. Obviously, it's more so the ordinary people's act is to be greedy, basically, right? Greedy, materialistic, yes, materialistically, of course, yes, but also like it's just the mental state itself is like mental state itself is poor as well, in a way, right?
Yeah.
If you become a greedy person, you always look over the fence what other people have, and you focus on what you don't have in comparison to what others have, right? In that sense as well. So the wise one, on the other hand, are the ones who see the right thing to be doing, in a sense, right? And for a wise person, you just think that what you can be helpful of others, right? That could be, yes, sharing what you have materialistically and the food and things like that. But also it could be that wise person's wisdom that she or he has, right? And or just could be love, or could be anything like that, just to bring the kindness to the world, right? And you don't expect anything in return, and that's wise person ought to be, right? So more of that kind of aspect. It's a lot more complicated than just the sharing wealth, I think. And again, we've mentioned many times that Taoism is most natural, democratic philosophy, that is, because the people who follow Taoist principles do what is necessary in that moment, right, without thinking too much about it. So if someone needs help, you go and help them in many different ways. If it needs advice, if it needs some help in many different ways, then you go out and help, and that is right thing to be doing. If you're thinking about what is the right thing to be doing in that situation, you're already overthinking, I think. So it's a lot more complicated than just sharing the wealth.
Yeah, that's right. Like what you were mentioning, it's also about people being spiritually impoverished, right? So they're spiritually impoverished. And so the way of the people, unfortunately, becomes the way that a lot of people live. Like you said, people are often looking over the fence. We live in a cult of comparison. And so part of this chapter is about that keeping up with the Jones mentality as well, like, because Lao Tzu's talking about the way of the people as opposed to the way of the sage. And the way of the people, unfortunately, is always looking over the fence like, wow, they got that new Ferrari, you know what I mean? Like, and so there's always this cult of comparison. And so what happens? You have these bandwagon movements where people are trying to just keep up with the Joneses, like, oh, so this is the new beliefs, the new trends, the new fads. Yeah. And then you have people being led just like a herd of sheep, like a lamb to slaughter, And so the sage is completely different. The sage always thinks for themselves. They can see when something just, that don't seem right there, you know what I mean? Like, and so in just the last few years, with all of the nonsense that has gone on around the world, unfortunately, people followed the way of the people, right? People followed the herd, whatever the narrative was that was spun around them in relation to the pandemic and things like that. And so people just followed the herd, whereas the sage is still sitting in the back going, that don't make sense. There's something a little bit wrong with what's going on around here. Why are people just not questioning, just following, and so forth and so on? So that's an example of the way of the people, right, as opposed to the way of the sage.
Yes.
And so that comes from a state of being spiritually impoverished, like what you were saying, because you become spiritually impoverished when you are following the herd, when you are looking over the fence at what someone has and what you lack, and so forth and so on, instead of being content with the way you are and what you have.
That's right.
We often look at that in the wrong way. We always look at what we don't have rather than what we do have.
Yes.
And so if we sit back, and I know that sometimes this is hard to do when you're in sort of the toil of your own life, but if you sit back just for a little moment each day and you just think about what you have, gratitude begins to build in your life. You know what I mean? Oh, I have a beautiful wife. I have the ability to talk to people on the podcast, and there's a good coffee shop down the road. So forth and so on. Go to whatever length you will. But look at the good things in your life, and then gratitude begins to build. But the way of the people is always looking at what you lack. And so you're operating from a scarcity mindset, constantly operating from a scarcity mindset. Oh, when am I going to have this amount of money? When am I going to get the promotion? Rather than just thinking like, man, I've got enough money. I don't need a promotion, because that doesn't define who I truly am. And so when you operate from that place, you're not spiritually impoverished. You're nourishing your soul, actually. And then you can live your life in a very carefree way by abiding by the principle of wu wei.
Yes, so our anxiety in the modern days, it mostly comes from thinking too much about the future, especially. Thinking too much, yes, it does bring a lot of anxiety itself. But thinking especially too much about the future brings a lot more anxiety, because there's an uncertainty. Of course it's uncertain, because in the future, it's not supposed to be certain. Even if you have lots of money and lots of things that you possess and whatnot, but still, the future, you never know what holds for you, really. And not thinking too much about the future, and finding things that you already have, and which gives you special moments in your daily life, and focus on those things are often much more important. And that brings to the present moment that you have a feeling of being alive somewhat, right? So those things enriches your life, and that is the wise one's perspective over life and the world.
Yeah, the wise sage does embrace uncertainty, throws themselves into the wilderness of life, doesn't have a path to follow, is okay to go where the wind will blow, so to speak, right? Within reason, obviously. But that message from the sage of following that uncertainty, of realizing that the future will be what it will be without our conscious interference of it, because it's just going to be how it's going to be. You can plan, you can strategize, and this may be good if you're running a business and this and that, but life has a certain way.
Yes.
The Tao always has a certain way to soften your heart and mellow your mind. And so the sage is just starting from that place, walking into the wilderness, butt naked, and just following where the Tao is going to lead them.
Yes.
And I think that if we look at this chapter and what we can learn, is that that's good advice when we look at, rather than following like the way of the people, we can follow the way of the sage. And we too can walk with confidence into uncertainty, into that wilderness, because the Tao is truly guiding our life. So guys, we hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you guys next time.